Part 1, Dreams Across the Ocean. Imagine standing on the deck of a small, weather-worn ship, its wooden hull creaking against the push of the Atlantic. The year is 1607, and three English vessels, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, are slicing through grey waves, bound for a land no one aboard has ever seen. The wind smells of salt and fear. The sea is endless, and so is the uncertainty. These men, about 104 of them, are not pilgrims, not quite explorers, and certainly not farmers. They are dreamers, gamblers, second sons of English families who will inherit no land back home. Many are adventurers, others are craftsmen, and some are simply desperate souls chasing fortune or freedom. They have left behind the crowded streets of London, where plague and poverty choke the air, and they are sailing toward a rumor, a place called Virginia, where gold supposedly glitters in the rivers and a New England could rise upon fertile shores. But the dream of empire was not born on the sea. It began in the minds of merchants and courtiers long before the sails were raised. England, in the early 1600s, was a rising power hungry to compete with the mighty Spanish Empire, whose colonies in the Americas were pouring wealth into Madrid. The Virginia Company of London, a joint stock venture, promised investors both glory and profit. Their mission, establish a settlement, find riches, and spread English civilization, all while converting the heathen natives to Christianity. To King James I, granting the charter was a stroke of strategy. A colony could weaken Spain, expand trade, and create a place to offload restless men who might otherwise stir trouble at home. To the merchants, it was business. To the settlers, it was destiny. After months at sea, battered by storms and sickness, the three ships finally sighted land in late April 1607. The coast was lush and green, dotted with tall pines and shimmering rivers. They anchored at Cape Henry, near the mouth of what would later be called the Chesapeake Bay. For a brief moment, the weary travelers rejoiced. They had made it. But as they explored the coastline, the English soon realized they were not alone. The region was home to the Powhatan Confederacy, a powerful alliance of about 30 native tribes led by the paramount chief Wahunsenkaw, whom the English would call Powhatan. His domain stretched across much of the region, and his people had lived there for centuries, fishing, farming, and hunting along the rivers that fed the bay. To them, the arrival of pale strangers with floating wooden houses was both a curiosity and a threat. The English, eager to find a defensible location, sailed up the James River and chose a peninsula about 40 miles inland. It offered deep water for their ships, protection from Spanish raiders, and what they thought was safety from the local tribes. On May 14, 1607, they began to build James Fort, named for their king. It was the birth of Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in North America. The fort, at first, was little more than a crude triangle of wooden palisades. Inside, the settlers built tents and rough cabins, while cannon stood watch at each corner. They hoisted the English flag, the Red Cross of St. George, and held a prayer of thanksgiving. For a moment, hope filled the humid Virginia air. But Jamestown's story was never a tale of simple triumph. From its first summer, it was a battle for survival. The men who landed in Virginia were mostly gentlemen, unaccustomed to labor, ignorant of the land, and convinced that riches lay just beneath the soil. They searched for gold instead of planting crops. They argued over leadership, fought over rations, and ignored the dense swarms of mosquitoes rising from the nearby swamp. The water they drank was brackish and foul. Within weeks, fever and dysentery spread. The wilderness, beautiful yet unforgiving, began to claim its toll. The Powhatan people watched with wary eyes. At first, they offered food and guidance. They traded corn for beads, tools, and copper. But as English demands grew and their behavior turned arrogant, relations began to sour. Suspicion hardened into hostility. It was during these fragile first months that a young soldier named Captain John Smith began to emerge as the colony's unlikely savior. Smith was no aristocrat. He was a hardened adventurer, a man who had fought the Turks, escaped slavery, and survived more battles than most of his companions could imagine. To the English gentleman who looked down on him, he was rough and uncultured. But to Jamestown, he was the one man who understood how to survive. Smith's leadership was blunt but effective. He imposed discipline, forced the men to work, and began trading systematically with the Powhatan tribes for food. His rule was simple: he that will not work, shall not eat. It was harsh, but it kept the colony alive. Still, Jamestown remained on the edge of disaster. That first summer, disease, malnutrition, and heat claimed dozens of lives. The settlers buried their dead at night to hide their weakness from the native tribes. And yet, more ships kept coming, bringing new settlers, new supplies, and new dreams. In the autumn of 1608, Smith and several men ventured into Powhatan territory, hoping to secure an alliance. It was during this expedition that Smith was captured by Powhatan warriors and brought before the chief himself. What happened next would become one of the most famous, and most debated, moments in early American history. Smith later claimed that he was about to be executed when Pocahontas, Powhatan's young daughter, threw herself across his body, saving his life. Whether this dramatic scene truly happened or was later embellished by Smith is uncertain. But the event, real or not, became a symbol of two worlds meeting, of peace amid conflict, and of a fragile thread connecting the English and the native people. After Smith's release, a period of uneasy trade and diplomacy followed. Pocahontas often visited the fort, bringing food and gifts. For a time, it seemed that coexistence might be possible. But beneath the surface, tensions grew. The English wanted land and resources, the Powhatan wanted respect and restraint. Neither side fully understood the other. And while Jamestown struggled to survive, England continued to send more settlers, swelling the tiny outpost into a fragile foothold of empire. By the end of 1608, the colony still had no gold, no easy riches, and no clear future. Yet the dream persisted. Against hunger, disease, and despair, the settlers clung to hope, the belief that they were part of something greater than themselves. As winter descended over the Virginia wilderness, the smoke from Jamestown's fires curled into the gray sky, a faint signal that the English had come to stay. The story of Jamestown was just beginning. Ahead lay the starving time, rebellion, redemption, and the birth of the first representative government in the New World. But before all that, before the tobacco boom, before the arrival of women, before the chains of slavery tightened on this soil, there was only survival. And survival, in the New World, would come at a terrible cost. They dreamed of empire, history tells us. But before they built it, they had to learn how not to die. Part 2, The Starving Time and the Fire of Survival. By the winter of 1608, Jamestown had already seen more death than triumph. Nearly half of the original settlers were gone. Some had died from disease, others from starvation, and many from sheer exhaustion. The swampy peninsula that once promised safety now reeked of decay. Mosquitoes bred in the stagnant water, spreading malaria. The once eager men who had dreamed of gold now dreamed only of bread. And yet, against all odds, the settlement still stood, a fragile triangle of hope clinging to life beside the dark James River. Captain John Smith, now the colony's de facto leader, worked tirelessly to hold it together. He enforced discipline, built defenses, and organized the men into work details. He traded with the Powhatan tribes, bringing corn and venison back to the starving settlement. But the peace was always fragile, and Smith knew it. He understood what many of his fellow settlers did not: Jamestown was not a fantasy. It was a fight. A fight against hunger, disease, and human folly. By 1609, the Virginia Company back in London was desperate for success. Investors wanted results, gold, land, or at least signs of progress. So they launched a massive effort, the Third Supply. 9 ships set sail with hundreds of settlers and precious supplies. The fleet was commanded by Sir George Somers and Sir Thomas Gates, bound to bring salvation to the colony. But the Atlantic had other plans. A violent hurricane tore through the fleet, scattering the ships. The Sea Venture, carrying the leaders and much of the supplies, was wrecked on the reefs of Bermuda. The survivors would remain stranded there for months, unaware that Jamestown's fate was slipping into darkness. Back in Virginia, Smith was left with about 200 settlers and dwindling food. The Powhatan Confederacy, weary of English demands and insults, began restricting trade. Tensions turned to violence. Raids, ambushes, and skirmishes erupted across the forest. The settlers built palisades, dug trenches, and prayed for the ships that never came. Then, in the fall of 1609, disaster struck from within. While exploring the Chickahominy River, John Smith was badly injured in a gunpowder explosion, some say by accident, others whisper it was sabotage. With severe burns, he was forced to return to England for treatment. And with his departure, Jamestown lost its backbone. The winter that followed, the winter of 1609 to 1610, would be remembered as the starving time. At the start of that winter, there were about 500 settlers in Jamestown. By spring, only 60 would remain alive. The Powhatan had surrounded the fort, cutting off all access to food. No hunting, no trade, no foraging beyond the walls. Inside, supplies ran out. Desperation turned to horror. First, they ate their horses. Then dogs, cats, and rats. Then the leather from their boots. They boiled roots and bark into thin, bitter soups. But starvation has no mercy. Some accounts, including the chilling testimony later recorded by colonial leaders, speak of cannibalism. One man was executed after killing his wife and salting her flesh. Whether all these tales were true or exaggerated, one fact was undeniable: Jamestown had become a nightmare. Imagine the scene: a handful of skeletal survivors, huddled beside smoky fires, surrounded by the endless forest. The fort that once symbolized hope now smelled of death. The men were too weak to bury their dead. The Virginia wilderness, silent and indifferent, swallowed the cries of a dying colony. And then, salvation. In May 1610, two small ships appeared on the James River. It was Sir Thomas Gates and the survivors of the Sea Venture. After months stranded on Bermuda, they had built two new vessels from the wreckage, the Deliverance and the Patience, and finally reached Virginia. When Gates and his men walked into Jamestown, what they saw broke their hearts. Bones littered the ground. The few remaining colonists staggered like ghosts. The fort's wooden walls sagged with rot. It seemed impossible that anyone had lived through it. Gates made the only logical decision: abandon the colony. He ordered the survivors to pack what little they could. On June 7, 1610, they boarded the ships and sailed down the James River. For a few fleeting hours, Jamestown, the first English colony in America, was officially dead. But fate, it seems, had one more twist to offer. As the ships neared the mouth of the Chesapeake, they spotted sails on the horizon. It was another English fleet, commanded by Lord de la Warr, Thomas West, the newly appointed governor of Virginia. He had come with fresh settlers, new supplies, and a royal mandate to restore the colony. De la Warr ordered the ships to turn back. Jamestown would not be abandoned after all. When the survivors returned upriver, the fort was repaired, fields were cleared, and hope, fragile as it was, flickered back to life. Under de la Warr's strict military rule, order was restored, but at a price. He imposed martial law. Anyone caught stealing food faced whipping, branding, or execution. Work was mandatory. Attendance at church was compulsory. The colony became an armed camp, not a community, but a survival machine. Still, the settlers endured. They rebuilt their walls, planted new crops, and resumed cautious trade with the Powhatan tribes. Life returned, but so did violence. De la Warr's policy toward the natives was brutal. He believed that only fear would secure English control. His soldiers raided Powhatan villages, burned homes, destroyed crops, and killed indiscriminately. The fragile peace that had once existed under John Smith was gone. For the Powhatan people, it was an invasion, a relentless tide of foreigners who destroyed the land they had lived on for generations. For the English, it was a crusade for survival and dominion. Two worlds were colliding, and Jamestown was the spark. By 1611, new leaders arrived, Sir Thomas Dale and Sir Thomas Gates, once again sent to enforce order and ensure the Virginia Company's investment did not fail. They built new settlements upriver, Henricus, Bermuda Hundred, and others, expanding English control deeper into Powhatan territory. Slowly, Jamestown began to stabilize. The lessons of disaster were hard learned, no more searching for gold, no more idle dreams. Survival now depended on discipline and work. But one discovery would soon change everything, and turn Jamestown from a dying outpost into the seat of an empire. A young settler named John Rolfe, who had arrived with the survivors of Bermuda, began experimenting with a strange plant, tobacco. The native tribes already grew it, but Rolfe introduced a milder strain from the Caribbean, more pleasing to European tastes. In the ashes of failure, a new economy began to take root. Tobacco would become the lifeblood of Virginia, and the chain that bound it to England's fortunes for centuries to come. By the time the sun rose over Jamestown in the spring of 1611, the settlers stood amid the ruins of their suffering, thinner, harder, changed forever. They had endured hunger, disease, war, and death. They had buried friends, enemies, and dreams. But they had not left. And that, in itself, was victory. The starving time did not end the dream of Virginia. It forged it, in hunger, in hardship, and in hope. Next time, we'll witness how Jamestown rose from its own ashes, how tobacco built an economy, how Pocahontas became a symbol of peace, and how the seeds of both democracy and slavery were planted in the same soil. Part 3, Rebirth, Tobacco, and the Roots of America. When the sun rose over Jamestown in 1611, it did not shine on a city of gold, but on a colony that had learned how to endure. The few who survived the starving time stood on haunted ground. But from that suffering, something powerful began to grow, resilience. Under the iron hand of Sir Thomas Dale and Sir Thomas Gates, the colony slowly clawed its way back to life. They rebuilt the fort, enforced strict laws, and expanded new settlements farther up the river, places like Henricus and Bermuda Hundred. The wilderness that had once swallowed men now began to yield to English axes and plows. Yet discipline alone could not feed a colony or justify its cost. The Virginia Company needed profit, something to send back across the Atlantic that would silence the investors' doubts. That answer came from one man, and one plant. In 1612, a young settler named John Rolfe began experimenting with tobacco. The native Powhatan tribes had long grown it for ritual and medicine, but Rolfe had acquired seeds from a sweeter strain in the Caribbean. Against all odds, the plant thrived in Virginia's soil. By 1614, Rolfe had shipped his first crop to England, and it sold for an astonishing profit. The English were hooked. Tobacco became the colony's salvation. Soon, every available acre was turned into a tobacco field. Settlers cleared forests, drained marshes, and bent the wilderness into rows of green. The crop was labor-intensive, exhausting, but it made men rich. It gave purpose to the colony, and finally, Jamestown began to flourish. But with prosperity came change, and moral consequence. To cultivate more tobacco, the settlers needed more land. That meant pushing farther into Powhatan territory, violating treaties, and destroying native villages. Conflict returned, sharper and bloodier than before. Still, amid this tension, one story stood out, a fragile moment of peace between two worlds. John Rolfe, the planter who had brought tobacco to life, met Pocahontas, the daughter of Chief Powhatan. By this time, she was about 17, and had been taken captive during one of the English raids. During her captivity, she was taught English, baptized as Rebecca, and introduced to English society. Rolfe fell in love with her, and she, perhaps out of faith, kindness, or diplomacy, agreed to marry him. Their marriage in 1614 marked a rare truce between the English and the Powhatan Confederacy. For several years, the two peoples lived in relative peace. When Pocahontas later traveled to England in 1616, she was received as a celebrity, the Indian princess, proof that the New World could be tamed and civilized. But behind the smiles and portraits, she was also a symbol of something deeper, the fragile dream of harmony that the New World could not keep. She died in England the following year, at just 21 years old, far from the forests where she had once played as a child. Her story became legend, romanticized and retold, but beneath it lay tragedy, a story of two worlds destined to misunderstand each other. Meanwhile, Jamestown's fortunes grew. By 1619, the colony had transformed from a desperate outpost into a thriving settlement of about 1,000 people. Tobacco exports filled English coffers, and new settlers poured in. But that same year, 1619, something extraordinary and deeply symbolic happened. In July, the settlers gathered in the Jamestown church and formed the House of Burgesses, the first representative legislative assembly in English America. For the first time, free men elected their own lawmakers. It was the beginning of self-government, the earliest seed of American democracy. And just weeks later, in that same fateful summer, another ship arrived. Its name was the White Lion, and aboard it were about 20 Africans, men and women taken from their homeland, sold to the English colonists. They were the first recorded Africans in British America. Some were treated as indentured servants, others as slaves. No one at the time could imagine what this moment would grow into, that the arrival of those 20 souls marked the beginning of a 250-year nightmare of slavery on American soil. So there, in 1619, two worlds collided once again, the dream of liberty and the reality of bondage. Freedom and oppression. Democracy and slavery. Born in the same year, in the same place, Jamestown. That contradiction would echo through every chapter of American history to come. The years that followed were both golden and bloody. Tobacco brought wealth, but also greed. Settlers demanded more land, more labor, and more power. The Powhatan Confederacy resisted fiercely, leading to wars that destroyed villages and claimed countless lives. In 1622, Powhatan's successor, Chief Opechancanough, launched a massive coordinated attack on English settlements, killing more than 300 colonists, nearly a third of Virginia's population. In response, the English retaliated with brutal force, burning villages, poisoning food supplies, and pushing the Powhatan deeper into the wilderness. The dream of peaceful coexistence died that year, and with it, the last illusion that the New World would be built without blood. By 1624, the Virginia Company collapsed under the weight of mismanagement, war, and scandal. King James I revoked its charter, making Virginia a royal colony under direct control of the crown. Jamestown remained its capital, still standing, though scarred by fire, famine, and conflict. Over the next decades, as more settlers arrived and plantations spread along the James River, Jamestown evolved from a fort into a town, and from a town into a symbol. It became the nucleus of English America, the place where the promise and peril of colonization first took root. Think of it, everything that would define America, freedom, ambition, opportunity, inequality, resistance, all began here. The tobacco that fueled the economy. The assembly that gave birth to democracy. The arrival of the first enslaved Africans. The fragile peace symbolized by Pocahontas. And the endless struggle between idealism and survival. All of it began on that swampy peninsula beside the James River. Today, Jamestown is quiet. The fort is gone, the river still flows, and the land has reclaimed much of what was once built. Tourists walk the paths where soldiers once stood guard, and archaeologists dig through the earth, uncovering fragments of a story written in blood, sweat, and hope. But if you listen closely, beyond the rustle of trees and the whisper of the river, you can almost hear them still, the voices of those first dreamers. They came chasing gold, but they found something far greater and far darker, the beginning of a new world. From Jamestown came a nation, not yet free, not yet equal, but alive with the restless spirit that would one day become America. Like this video, subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next one.